I am Augusta DeLomo. I'm here with my colleague Brian Franklin. Today is October 28th, 2023, and we are in New York City. We are interviewing David Langbart. David, will you please introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm David Langbart. I'm Cornell class of 1979.
Great. David, can you start us off with how you met Walter LaFeber?
So, when I was in high school, I had a high school friend who did a summer program at Cornell. And she came back talking about this wonderful professor of foreign policy, something that I had gotten very interested in high school. And so when I got to Cornell, I saw that he was teaching a freshman seminar on presidential power since 1945. And I decided I would like to try and get into that class. It was a class that you needed the professor's signature on your card to get into. And luckily, in luck of the draw, for freshman registration, I had a slot at the first registration time, and so I was at the head of the line to get into to Uris Library where registration was, and I made a beeline for where he was going to be, and he was sitting there in a chair next to a table, and I walked up to him and said I would like to be in his freshman seminar, and he probably asked me one or two questions, and he said fine, and I handed him my card. He signed his card, but what I remember most was that before he gave me the card back, he reached into his briefcase, which was next to him, pulled out a slip of paper and said, "Here's the reading assignment for the first class." And it was not a small reading assignment. And indeed, I still have that slip of paper.
Wow. And what was the first assignment?
So the first, if I remember correctly, we had to read Strunk and White's Elements of Style. This was a freshman writing class, so writing, style, and everything counted. And we had to read several chapters from Arthur Schlesinger's Imperial Presidency.
Wow. And so you took this class as a freshman?
First semester freshman.
What did you think as you were in that class as you started approaching it?
I knew of Walter LaFeber. I did not know exactly just how prominent he was. It was a class of a whole lot of really go-getters.
When do you think you started to get that sense of, okay, this is a truly exceptional scholar, teacher?
The exceptional teacher was evident from the first class. Just his presentation and his relationship. So, for example, I had everybody back then, you had the impression, big name professor, doesn't deal with freshmen. So first of all, that he had a freshman seminar was really impressive. But his dealings with us, we were going through the syllabus, and we got to the point of office hours. And of course, big name professors have had a reputation at the time of not being available. And he said, so my office hours are, it was like 2 hours on Tuesday afternoons, 2 hours on Thursday afternoons, and he said, but feel free to stop by the office anytime. And he said, and if I'm not in the office, I'm very likely in my study carrel in Olin Library. It's a graduate library. So it's room number. Just tell the people at circulation desk you want to come up and see me. Come on up. And he said, well, if you really need to get a hold of me, here's my phone number at home. Just call, but it's got to be important. He said, and then this is where we lived. At the time he lived within walking distance. He says, just walk on over. We'll probably be home by the time you get there. And some of my students have become very good friends with my neighbors in the past, completely upending the whole notion of a professor who was not available. And just dealing with him in the class, just how he dealt with us was really incredible.
Can you talk us through maybe some of your most important or memorable interactions with him while you were an undergraduate?
Well, that class was one. I asked him to be my advisor after that class, and he agreed to be my advisor. I mean, his classes were amazing. I'm sure you've heard this from everybody. His lectures were amazing. It was like he was talking to you. I mean, he was a class full of people, and you would have thought he was talking to you. You're just having a conversation. Here you're sitting down with somebody and they were explaining things to you. His lectures were amazing. And he really truly was available all the time.
What did you do your thesis on with him?
So my senior year, he was on leave, so I did not do my thesis with him. I was very disappointed, but I did do my thesis with Joel Silby, who was one of Walter LaFeber's very, very good friends. And so actually, when I took the second half of his introductory history of American Foreign Relations class, you could do an extra credit paper. And so I actually did an extra credit paper for that class. It was sort of, probably would have qualified as an honors thesis or something like that. So that was a really, really good experience. I actually took the paper that I had written for that freshman seminar and just dug down even deeper and deeper into it. It was a really good experience. What
were your big intellectual takeaways as you were in his class? What were the things that you learned that stick with you now?
The biggest thing I took away from is don't think you know it all. Even when you think you you don't have all the information. The one thing that I remember him saying one time, I was in the class and I said, what I understand is I don't know everything that I need to know. And he said, then I've taught you what you need to know. It's just, it's the constant search for answers. And to know that when you think you know it, there may be more, so don't stop.
So you took the first freshman seminar class with him and then you took one more?
So I took freshman seminar, my first semester. My sophomore year, it was 2 classes. In the fall semester, first half of American Foreign Policy, second semester, second half of Foreign Policy. And I also did an independent readings with him.
Wow. Can you talk us through a little bit of, we've heard obviously about how great of a teacher he was and how much he cared specifically about the undergraduates, of the community of undergraduates around you that were also taking these classes and how you all thought about him and engaged with him?
When I was in that freshman seminar, there were people who were impressed. You got into a freshman seminar with Walter LaFeber. It was a really impressive thing. I hung around with a bunch of engineers and non-history major type people, so they knew who he was, but it wasn't the type of thing that I talked about. I actually got to know some of the TAs in that class better than my fellow classmates. Doug Little, who's been here, he's one of my TAs.
Wow.
Right.
We interviewed him this morning.
Yeah. So, Doug and I go way, way back. Yeah. And some of the, so I actually had more interactions with my TAs and the other graduate students in the history department than fellow undergraduates.
One of the ways that we heard Walt described by one of his other undergraduates is that he was a motivator, an igniter of different thoughts and ideas, and not dictating to you where you should go, but just pushing you to go wherever you wanted to go. Was that your experience with him?
My experience with him was, first of all, in that freshman seminar, I still have all the papers. I work at the National Archives. I keep things.
Right.
If I have any ability as a writer, it's based on what he taught me. But when he was trying to elicit something from you, it was questions. He asked questions. What about this? Have you thought about this? He didn't dictate to you. He asked you. He asked probing questions. So like the extra credit paper that I worked on in the early drafts, he had asked something, and I still remember one of his comments on the final thing. I got a very good grade on it, but he said, I still see you were unwilling to speculate, and there was a question, and part of it was, I mean, I can speculate with the best of them, but I didn't have any evidence to make a speculation, so I wasn't going to go there. Mm-hmm. And even though he's the one who raised the question, I learned that from him. Don't go where you don't have any evidence.
So you finish at Cornell, and then where do you go next?
So actually, after Cornell started while I was still at Cornell. So when I went to Cornell, my plan was to go to law school. My dad was a lawyer. My dad retired as an administrative law judge. And I had gotten the law stuff at dinner table and the thinking critical. So I decided, even that I was interested in history, but I thought history major, good preparation for law school, critical thinking skills, writing, etc. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, and during Christmas break in my sophomore year, I put in applications for summer jobs with all of the agencies that had history-type programs, National Park Service, Smithsonian, there were a couple others, and also the General Services Administration, which oversaw at the time the National Archives. And the National Archives offered me a federal summer internship. I took the job. I was familiar with the archives. A friend of the family worked at the National Archives, so it was not an alien thing to me. I knew about it, and I took the job, and I was hired at the archives to do scut work. The person who hired me told me that many years later. But the second or third week that I was there, there was some staff shortage. People gone on vacation, and a couple of people were out sick. And the section chief that I worked for told the branch chief this, and the branch chief said, well, I can give you some people from the other side of the branch. And he said, well, this summer guy seems to be pretty smart. Let me try and give him some work. And so they started giving me real work to do. I wasn't just standing at a Xerox machine. And I even before that, just working with the original records, there's something touching the documents. It was kind of visceral. I mean, I don't know how to explain it, but it became immediate. Working with the records is really cool. The records are really cool, so I started thinking this is the type of thing, career-wise. Law school was still out there. At the end of my summer, they asked me if I was interested in coming back. And I said, sure. And I went back at the beginning of my junior year, and I talked to Walt about this. And Walt was immediately very encouraging about the importance of knowledgeable archivists to the historical profession. He said, it's not teaching, it's not this, but he says, it was just as important. Because even at that point, I knew I probably didn't have the temperament to be a teacher. And so with Walt's encouragement, when they finally came through and said, we'd like you to come back next summer, I did. I was working with Justice Department records. And after I graduated, I could still work until the end of the fiscal year. I could keep the job. And so I went back after I graduated, and I had already decided I was not going to go immediately to graduate school. I wanted to work for a while. I wanted to give my brain a rest. And at the time, jobs in the archives were a little tight, but there were two possibilities. And my branch chief put in a good word with me in both, and I interviewed for both. And so I had my choice of two jobs, neither of which were real appealing, but in the government, the first step is get your foot in the door. And then near the end of the summer, a longtime employee at the archives who worked in the diplomatic branch announced that she was retiring. And my branch chief knew of my relationship with Walt and said, you will want to go down and talk to the branch chief. And I did, and I had an interview, which turned out it was a job interview. I didn't have just go down and talk to him, but it was more of an interview. In government, things don't happen fast. When somebody, in those days, when somebody retired, they had to retire, then the job got posted, and and it could be from the time somebody retired to the time a job got posted, it could be 6 months. And this person was retiring in 6 weeks. And at the end of the interview, the branch chief in the diplomatic branch said, don't take another job at the archives until you talk to me. And he basically made 6 months of work happen in 6 weeks. And so I got hired into the diplomatic branch.
Wow.
And that started a permanent career at the archives. I did not stay in the diplomatic branch my whole career. I was working at a level considered non-professional. It's called an archives technician. I wanted to be an archivist. That's the people who, the more professional. I worked in the diplomatic branch for about 5 years, and then went to another branch to work primarily with military records, but also some intelligence records, and was into the archives training program. And during the training program, we do rotations in the various parts of the archives. And I did a rotation in the appraisal division. Not all U.S. government records are permanent. There's a process where we make a selection. It's in the appraisal process. And I was very, very heavily recruited to come and work there. And I decided this would be a really good experience. I planned to work there for about 2 years, and then I would go back working with the records and the stacks. And I ended up spending 22 years in appraisal, where I became the primary appraiser of records of the foreign policy agencies, the record agencies in the Executive Office of the President, and the national level intelligence agencies. Like I said, I did that for about 22 years, and then about 15 years ago, I went back into the what we refer to as custodian, working directly with the records. And since that time, I have been the senior specialist on foreign affairs records at the National Archives.
So throughout this career, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No. I was just going to ask, now in this career in the archives, after having left Cornell, and across these different journeys in that, how do you see yourself interacting with Walt's work, whether it's in research or how he approached teaching and things that you took from that, or just his approach to documents? How do you see that influencing your work?
So that's what I was going to say. So early on, I helped Walt with his research. Actually, not just early on, from then on, I helped Walt with his research, and he was always very kind enough to acknowledge me in his books. But more important, when I needed some kind of specialized knowledge, I could write to Walt and he would respond. Or there were a couple times I brainstormed with him. I'm thinking about this, and I just, something I wasn't clear on, didn't know enough about, and he was always very willing to help. A lot of the appraisal work I did on foreign affairs and other internationally related records, a lot of it came from what I learned from Walt in his lectures, but also in his books. And I actually pushed a lot of things in areas, records that we should be keeping that most people didn't think we should keep, and I'm saying, but no, this is important, and I could point to Walt or things that he pointed to. Walt also sent me a number of his students, and I helped them and recommended me, to other scholars, and so I was able to help them. But Walt was always there, somebody I could rely on for some kind of expertise. There were a couple times I referred to having a Cornell mafia. There were several people. Walt was always at the top of the list when I thought that I knew the answer, but I needed some outside support for that. I could write to them saying, this is the issue I'm dealing with, and they would send me the type of thing I could quote, when I was writing an appraisal memo, I could quote a distinguished historian or something like that. And so there were people, it was a somewhat of a symbiotic relationship.
Were there, you mentioned you can recall specific instances. Were there particular kinds of archives that Walt was really, pushing and saying, we need more of these kinds of records that can get us access to these kinds of questions?
Walt never actually pushed. I mean, I think he relied on me. What I knew, I shared with him a lot of the work that I was doing, and he was always very supportive. And I think I had a very conservative approach to doing records appraisal. There are people who, because part of the records appraisal is economy, efficiency, and government. You get rid of all the crap. Save only what's really important. And there are people who, in my perspective, were overly aggressive in getting rid of records. I always took a very conservative approach, because if you throw it away, you cannot bring it back. But if you say, we're going to keep it, down the line, once you see a better concept of the universe of records of a time and how people may or may not be using them, then you can throw them away. And so I took a very conservative approach to records appraisal. Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I've both read in the volume and we've heard from others here is some of Walt's public efforts were around declassification. And could you talk to us a little bit about that?
So Walt was very, very active in declassification. That was not an area in the archives that I worked on. I was very familiar with. There were times when Walt would ask me questions. And of course, working at the archives, I had to be very careful with what the information I shared with him. But I shared with him what I could share with him. But Walt did, and a lot of what Walt did on that was behind the scenes. He was not. I mean, there were a couple times he was very public, but Walt was not a grandstander. He looked for the ways to accomplish the task. And if he could accomplish the task without anybody ever knowing that he had his fingerprints on it, fine with him. The task was the important thing. Mm-hmm. But there were times when he would speak out.
We've heard, and I also read in the volume there's participants that would have noted that Walt would have not liked being described as a scholar activist, but some people have described him that way. And I'm curious how you have seen and think about his public role and what the public side of his work, whether it was his talks or his work in the archives, how you saw himself seeing that role that he carved out.
Walt was a historian. I think I agree with the calling him a scholar activist. Early on, before I started working at the archives, before I was in college, he was a member of the Department of State's Advisory Committee on Historical Diplomatic Documentation. It's the academic advisory committee to the Department of State overseeing the publication of the series Foreign Relations of the United States, which is the official documentary history of the United States. Walt was the first of the so-called New Left historians ever appointed to that committee. And he ended up, at that time you were given 4-year terms. His 4th year, he was chairman of the committee. And he pushed hard, one, to have FRUS include a lot, but also to have it include important things. And he came onto the committee just at the time when the committee was starting to deal with the post-World War II documents. And it's at that point that the whole issue of classification, declassification becomes much more complex. The United States becomes much more active in the world. Also, the Foreign Relations series starts to incorporate documents from multiple agencies. It's no longer primarily Department of State. Because the United States is so heavily involved with other governments. There's foreign government information. You have the creation of the CIA and things like that. The whole process of choosing and getting the documents declassified just became really, really difficult. And Walt was pushing for access and pushing for openness. And so I do agree with calling him a scholar activist. But Walt probably would have just looked at that. This is what a good scholar does. He was supporting his profession by being on this committee, which is something he did not like being on committees. He didn't like going to conferences. He didn't like being on committees. But this was a really important one. So yeah, I agree with that appellation.
When you talk about how much he pushed for access and declassification, we've heard from other people about just how much he loved primary sources and he loved documents and he loved doing the process of research. Can you talk us through what you saw of that from him as someone who worked with him in the research side?
Well, his works were well researched. I'll be honest. I sometimes wish I could have gotten him into the archives more often. I mean, there are things that I wish he had come and done research in. But he was the scholar. He made the choice of what he was looking at. But yeah, he was. I mean, it's like I said earlier. I wasn't gonna speculate about something without evidence. He was an evidence-based historian.
As someone who's worked on, all of these different projects with him, we have both marveled at just the scope of what he has done as a scholar. There's very few scholars that have the range of topics that he wrote on, the time frame. What would you say are the intellectual through lines that you can see between all of these different works?
Boy, that's a good question. Listening to the other presentations today, I think that Walt, the through line is democracy in America, and how American foreign policy either promotes or damages democracy in America. How expansion in our early years, continental expansion, promoted democracy, but international expansion may have damaged our democracy. So I think democracy in America is probably, and living up to our ideals. I think Walt believed in the ideals that the founding fathers had for our country, and like I hope all of us are, when those ideals are not lived up to, we're disappointed in our leaders.
When you think about Walt as a historian and as a scholar, what do you see as his contribution to the field or contribution to the way we think about foreign affairs?
Well, he's trained a number of incredibly important scholars. His graduate students have done incredible work. I like to think of myself and the work that I've done in the archives as one of his legacies also. So I think he's not only helped us understand the history of the United States, but based on the work that I've done that was heavily influenced by him, helped to preserve the history of our country, which I think is just as important as the scholarship.
Do you have any favorite or memorable interactions with him later in life after you left Cornell?
That's a good question. Some of those are, yes, but I'm not, no.
Was there a point where, you see him obviously as a mentor, and are there ways that you see his mentorship impacting the way you mentor young archivists that you work with now?
Walt was always kind and always willing to listen to questions. I probably don't have the level of kindness that Walt had, but I'll sit there and listen. I'll answer 1,000 questions. I love answering questions. And at times when I've been supposed to give a presentation to a group of people, I said, you all just come with your questions. I just want to answer questions. But I think if people need help, I'm willing to help.
Yeah. Would you say, you talked about the importance of Walt's students in all of these fields, in the archive, and we've talked to some policymakers and in academia, but often scholars lose, I think, the importance of the archive and just how essential that is. Do you think that, if Walt was looking now at what we see with the archives and with declassification in presidential libraries and NARA, do you think that he would have wanted to continue to be involved in that kind of work?
I would hope so, and in fact, there's some things that have happened in the last few years that I would encourage him to be more involved. Mm-hmm. I think Walt recognized the importance of the archives. You can't do anything without the records. The records are the basis of all. And he recognized that. I mean, that was one of the things when I was thinking of going into this, that was the point that Walt made to me. The archives are absolutely critical. Good archivists are critical to the historical profession, or anybody who's interested in doing retrospective documentary research, which is it's broader than history. I think yes, Walt would still be involved and probably more involved. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned, at his start that he was, I think you said, the first of the New Left historians that was on that committee. Can you talk just a little bit about what that was like before and why his presence was so essential there for people who don't know?
The advisory committee has had oversight of the preparation of foreign relations in the United States, and the series is compiled by the historians in the Office of the Historian at the State Department. The advisory committees provided them advice and guidance on what they were doing. I think the importance of Walt being on there is in the membership of the committee in the 60s was very, very heavily the traditionalists. And I don't want to say the anti-revisionists, but they were the traditionalists. They were the people that the revisionists were responding to. There was some criticism of the representation on the committee that new interpretations were not being represented, and Walt ended up being the first of the revisionists to be on the committee. I think that was partly in reflection of the impact of his book, America, Russia, and the Cold War. When he was on the committee, it had been out for 4 years, and he was actually doing a new revision. But I also think it was partly Walt wasn't a bomb thrower. Mm-hmm. Walt was, I think he already had a reputation as being a gentleman. And so he was the first one chosen. So I think it was very important. And there had been a long line of other people. Walt's, Richard Immerman, who has been so instrumental in this, he was chairman of the advisory committee more recently. Mm-hmm. So it's a continuum.
What is very interesting as an outsider is you really do see the cascading effects of Walt's mentorship, of opening all of these doors through his students, of continuing on the legacy in all of these different forms, of other people now serving on that committee who were his students. We were talking to one of the policymakers who said, he was sitting in a room and all of the people went to Cornell and most of them had taken his course. Do you feel that kind of community of people who have been part of that mentorship?
Unfortunately, there aren't a whole lot of Cornellians at the archives.
At NARA, yeah.
And I can think of only one other right now, mm-hmm. And her background is anthropology. Mm-hmm. And so I mean, I understand this, but I personally have not experienced the being in a room with Cornellians like that. But when you meet up with somebody from Cornell, it's always, when were you there? What was your major? And did you know this professor or that professor? And it doesn't matter what anybody's major was. If you mention Walter LaFeber, oh, I heard of him.
Mm-hmm. What do you, if you were talking to an undergraduate now about Walt, how would you describe like what it was like to be a young first year in that class?
It was a class of overachievers. I think everybody who went to Cornell goes to Cornell as an overachiever. A couple stories about that class. We were all trying to impress him. I mean, all of us. And there was one person in the class who was probably the smartest person in the class. And we'd all be talking, and we'd be, trying to explain things. And all of a sudden, this guy would lean forward and go, and everybody would get quiet. And all of a sudden, something absolutely brilliant would come out of his mouth. There'd be a moment of silence, and then everybody say, "Yeah, that's what we were trying to say." It was a class where it was a freewheeling thing. It was where it was clear that here's this big name professor. He's not there to tell us. He's there for us to learn, and he wanted to hear from us. That's the one thing. He wanted to hear from us. He wanted, he asked questions. He wanted to hear from us. It was also a pretty intense class. There were some, I can't remember which of the congressional hearings were going on that fall. And we came into the class one day, and Walt started talking about, the hearings. And we all just sat there silently. We didn't know what he was talking about. And he said, the hearings that have been on TV about. And finally, somebody in the class said, "What's television?" We were so busy studying and everything, none of us we didn't even know these hearings were on. And he kind of chuckled, and but it was the environment. It was an environment of inquiry. That's what it was all about. The inquiry, learning, getting to the answer of the questions that we had. The seminar was on presidential power, which was a big issue in the mid-'70s. We had just had Watergate and all that kind of stuff, and so you had a group of people who were really, really interested, and he was interested too.
I think to wrap us up, what would you like if this is the one thing someone is watching? What is the one thing you want them to know about him? There's more than one thing. One, he's a terrific scholar. He was a wonderful person. He was kind and he was generous with his time and his effort. He was, when they talk about the consummate scholar, if there's a dictionary that has consummate scholar, that's the picture. It should be Walter LaFeber. He was just a fabulous, fabulous teacher, friend, and scholar. All right. Thank you so much.